Okay, so this unit, CHCYTH002, for those who want to be technical, has a range of different elements around youth work and young people in general. So we're not going to be able to knock over all of those today, but they are all interrelated. Today, we're focusing on that first couple. In particular, the first, applying an understanding of the social, historical, economic, legal, and political young people. I'll be doing that within Australian context, but it's tricky to separate all of those. They're kind of interwoven and they're embedded in an international context. So, although I'm going to be telling this as a historical story, it actually encompasses a lot of what else is going on. You might have noticed, by the way, that this is about not just knowing about the historical, economic, legal, and political context, but applying them to your work. So let's begin by just looking at the history of youth, of the concept of youth, of young people. Within Australia, prior to the 1700s, children became adults, as we discussed in an earlier slide. This is pretty much the case across a range of other cultures too. The Jewish, the different parts of the world, different indigenous people, or different cultures in general, people move from being a child to an adult. There would be an initiation process, sometimes quite painful, sometimes quite brutal, very ceremonial, very public. So this is basically announcing to your community, I'm no longer that child. I'm an adult with all the rights that come with being an adult. I might be a junior member of adult society, but I am most definitely an adult now, able to make decisions and run for power positions and get married and have children. In Europe, an interesting thing happened in the 1700s, and that is that machinery, there was an industrial revolution. We'll talk about that some other time, but essentially it meant that these traditions continued, but a lot of people's living conditions became far, far worse because people were urbanized and dependent on wages rather than dependent on growing their food and running their own small business, if you like, as a farming or craft world. There were these big factories. You were dependent on the wage, and children was still present. It was dangerous. Lots of people lost limbs or lives working in the mills and things. And because we didn't have that separation, children were either a dependent or they were a worker. So in 1788, in the first fleet that came to Australia, there were, I think, 10-year-olds was the youngest. There were certainly young teens who had been tried and convicted as adults because that's what they were. They were treated as small adults. One of the other interesting things that was happening around that time was that there was a change in the attitude towards children as being these innocent creatures. So previously they'd been seen as, all adults had been seen as inherently broken and bad and in need of correction, need of constant discipline. There was this idea that basically said children are actually the innocent one. This particular painting is called The Age of Innocence. It's about they're innocent when they're little and it's only the corrupting influences. But at their core, the humanist ideal is they are innocent and ideal until things make them go worse. That was a middle class view that was starting to grow. Now, this is relevant. Part of what happened in the 1800s was people were starting to try, middle class and upper class people were trying to say, well, we're a bit outraged really at all of these small young adults misbehaving. They hang around on the streets, they play soccer on the streets. Our people would never do such a thing. They're having casual sex, they're taking way too many drugs, even though there's no law specifically about the age that you could do that. There was just a bit of outrage at their behaviour. So there were two. The first is they started to think of young adults as being a bit of a separate category. The first time that there was a legal category separate to being a child or an adult was often pitched at 1880. That's when they brought in the Public Instruction Act. That's when schooling became compulsory. It had been there previous to this, but as an optional thing for people of all ages, but it was certainly encouraged that it was young adults that would be doing that. Sunday schools and churches had a crucial role in all of this. Sunday school was quite different to what we think of as Sunday school now. It was very much when you weren't working during the week, you could actually learn to read and write, no matter what age you were, on the Sunday at the church. It was all connected. But this attitude was very much still about discipline, making people behave the way that we as society think they should. Now, at the same time, there was a bunch of people who were concerned with the well-being of children. These were the ones more likely to be thinking of children as being the innocent ones, and they're victims, and there's things that we should do. So for the first time, organisations specifically for young adults, is the YMCA is the classic one, but there's also programs specifically, benevolent societies, what's today called Anglicare, a range of other welfare services were all cropping up to help the disadvantaged, including young people. But that was that era, the late 1880s. Australia has stopped being a penal colony at this stage and is now finding its feet as a British colony, but as fairly independent. So there was two kind of contrasting ideals there. They're both quite authoritarian, but one is saying we're concerned about the well-being of children, and at the same time, we're getting organisations springing up for the well-being of the disabled, of the mentally ill, of various other areas. But okay, concerned with their well-being or concerned with the discipline, forcing them to behave the way that we as a society know that they should be. And they would both possibly cringe a little at these descriptions because they'd say, no, the discipline is for their own well-being. But there was certainly two different approaches there as the concept of youth begins. When we're talking compulsory schooling, we're talking compulsory schooling up to very early teens at this stage. So it's the birth of what some people call the nanny state of welfare services that people are forced to engage in, but we're still not talking youth being as long as it is now. It's still thinking about early teens. So one of the big changes that came about immediately after World War II was mass media. The television basically meant that there was advertisers driving this whole process, loving the fact that they could target whoever was around. What I didn't mention earlier was that after World War II, people decided to have babies. They had prolonged that. They put that off during the Depression, during World War II, and there was an official government policy that said we need to populate or we will perish. We need to have more and more children to populate this country. And worldwide, there was a huge boom anyway, right up until the early 60s. That meant that there's an incredible number of children. And with the advent of the television, that means there's an incredible amount of advertising, which they could direct. They didn't have to go through the parents. They could direct straight at young people. And there were specific products invented specifically and specific advertising and music and various other things. So suddenly youth is growing because it's a market in its own right. So we're not talking that authoritarian well-being or discipline anymore. We're talking mate, this is very empowering in its own way. You guys have a product. You guys are our customers. We want to sell stuff to you. We will make products specifically for this group, who were children in the 50s, but 60s and 70s, they were what we would now call youth, and they're forming their own culture. As the mass media issues, there was the women's rights and human rights movements. People were utterly disgusted at what they saw during World War II of the treatment of Jewish and Bolsheviks and church leaders and various others by the fascists throughout Europe and Nazi Germany in particular. And this concept that people have rights, regardless of what the government policy is at the time, people have rights. That was new. That was a whole new concept. And that really shaped the way things would be different. Remember, this is at the same time as the mass media is happening. So people are able to talk to each other and develop. And remember, this is at the same time as there's an incredible booming of people being born. So in the 60s and 70s, these are all teenagers, and it's seen as such a problem that they are trying to make the world the way they would like. They're used to things. They're being rebellious. They are fighting for their rights. They're used to having their own culture. They are doing stuff that is not what the adults in the room wanted them to do, and they start categorizing more and more. It's an easy way to dismiss an 18-year-old is to say, look, you're not really an adult yet, you're just a youth. So the youth age kind of grew because it's, them people that are misbehaving and being rebellious. We need to set up programs specifically for them. We need to do things to them or about them. Here's a little graph that shows the number of children on average that women were having. You can see it's hit a fairly low point during the Depression in the 30s, but you're still talking more than 2 kids on average per woman. That boomed. That went way up in the late 40s. And then an interesting thing, and that's why we had so many baby boomers. And one reason that wasn't sustained is that although it hit a peak in the 60s there, it dropped off remarkably quickly in the 60s and then again in the 70s. Some of you will know why that is already, but just to be clear, it's because for the first time there was reliable contraceptives available and people could choose to have sex and have fewer children. And that just added fuel to the fire for this rebellious youth image because, damn it, they were having sex prior to being married without the same consequences. I was going to say without consequence, but certainly without the major consequence as shown by the graph. And you can see that replacement rates since the 80s, on average, women have been having fewer than 2 children. So each couple is not actually replacing their own age. It's the baby boomers that cause that huge explosion in that area. So the system struggled a lot to control with that authoritarian, whether it's the disciplining or the well-being, either way, that's authoritarian models struggled either to force them to behave or to be kind. There were more youth services started in that era with one of these objectives, with either let's boost up how much we can force them to behave, or let's boost up how much we can be kind to them, but as victims of their world. But either way, how do we control these people? They're upsetting the status quo. But at the same time, there's a couple of new reactions, and that is that there's the Declaration of the Rights of Youth. There's a growing movement to look at young people as being people that we should be advocating, that they're disempowered, that we should give them some of the power. So remember me saying both of the other approaches so far have been authoritarian, about the people in control controlling young people. This is about giving them some more power. Let's lobby on behalf of them to give them the power to do things differently. And then an even more radical thought again is to say, rather than us advocating for them and empowering them, let's give them the power to make decisions for themselves. Scary thought at the time. It's like, no, they're a problem. We need to stop. They need to conform to society. So we've got 4 different ways, or 5 if we include the media, 4 different ways that services specifically for young people are seeing them. And a huge growth in them during that time, a huge growth in youth-specific services during that time. So there were services in the 70s set up to support homeless young people to leave an abusive family, for example. This was a first. They could be abandoned or they could be runaways in the past, but these were services actually following the women's refuge movement that actually said, let's upset the status quo, let's actually allow people to leave situations that are dangerous and abusive to them. And that was revolutionary, and that was so much a challenge to the status quo that it shocked a lot of people, but it gave them power, and it's a vital part of how youth services work today. The baby boomers gradually got older. There's a gradual rollback. For example, in 1980s, spray cans, hip hop, in amongst all of the culture of the 80s, I've spray painted the word CIS, Commonwealth Youth Support Scheme, is a classic example. It was a huge program that just allowed people to hang out. It was well patronised because there were a lot of young people and there were youth workers there, paid youth workers. Didn't used to be paid youth workers prior to the 70s, but there were paid youth workers there who you could ask for help and they would advocate for you, or they might even help you advocate for yourself. In the 80s, that got pulled back a little, quite subtly at first, to a program called Skillshare, it had more of a focus on, well, number one, it's targeted for those who are most in need, rather than just being for the general population. But it also had a focus on saying, well, since we're providing services just for those most in need, it's actually about you getting a job. And that grew to today's job network providers and a range of other programs. But the emphasis then on government funding is we don't need to fund things for your general well-being or to empower you in general. We're funding things specifically because that would help the economy, because we're spending money on it after all. You're free to run stuff in your own time with your own money, but we're going to fund stuff that is specifically about those who are most in need. So that's an example, but in the 80s, things settled down a little, but the concept of a paid youth worker was very, very entrenched by this stage. It's just what purpose they served. The idea of youth is growing. 2010, the minimum school leaving age jumps to 17. In the early 80s, it would be about half and half. People left they got the school certificate, which was the leaving certificate, they called it in the 50s. At 16, about half would leave, half would stay on to the higher school certificate, an additional was its original concept, and a small number would go on to university. 2010s, university became more the norm for everybody, and school leaving age became 17. You would need to have a very good reason to leave prior to that. And so, of course, then there's lots of discussion on okay, at what point should you get allowance to stay? There's an assumption in the youth allowance that says that you are up to 23, you're dependent on your parents, unless you can prove otherwise. So in effect, we would say that the age of youth has grown certainly up to 17, and typically you're expected to be dependent on your parents till 23. The people earlier in this slide show their children were about, their first child would have been 5, 6, 7 years old by the time you're 23. It's quite a different spin. So that then brings us to applying this. And I want you to just think about, and we'll take this to the forum, what do you think of youth? Maybe it's a personal thing and you don't want to share, I'm okay with that. But do you think, when you're thinking of youth and youth work, do you think of them as people who need to be corrected to become good and proper adults? Because there is a need for that. And I'm sorry if I've come across like I'm opposed to that idea, but there is a need for that. But instead, do you think youth and youth work is about supporting them to make them fit into society as a whole? Or alternatively, do you think of youth and youth services as being people who need us to advocate for them? Or do you think of youth as being people who we need to empower so that they can reach their own fullest potential? Or do you think of them as being a market for the products, the school projects, the concepts, the various things that we run for youth as youth workers? There's a range there of different ways, and I want you to stop and think about that. I'll put that into the lesson so that you can think about that after the video has ended.